Okay, algebra students, this is 1.7b, so we've talked about the absolute value equations. Now we're going to talk about what happens when there's a bunch of extra stuff with the absolute value on the same side of the equation. So what we're going to do is we are going to what we call isolate the absolute value. So we must get the absolute value by itself. Then I go ahead and do that separation of two equations. So when I'm looking at this, here's my absolute value thing. This is what I need to separate. I need to do x minus 2 equals a number and x minus 2 equals a negative number. So I have to get rid of anything else that's on that side. So what I have is a 4 right next to it. And remember, right next to indicates multiplication. So to undo multiplication, I have to divide. So I'm going to divide by the 4 on both sides. So that becomes 1 and kind of goes away. So now I have absolute value of x minus 2 equals 6. Now that I have the absolute value by itself, I can say that this number in here, this x minus 2, can be 6 or negative 6. And this is where I separate. Some people separate at the very beginning, and it will work sometimes, and it won't work most of the time. So it is more important that you follow the rules that consistently work out to give you the correct answer, so that way you don't develop bad mathematical skills and you have to relearn something. Because it's harder to learn it the wrong way, unlearn it, and then learn it the correct way, than it is just take the time to do it right the first time. So here, now we're just going to go ahead and solve our two equations. We add 2 on both sides. So my first solution is x equals 8. I add 2 on both sides. Now remember, because that's a negative 6, we're going to get a different number. So negative 6 plus 2 gives me negative 4. And those are my two solutions. Now I believe this would be the type of problem that if you were to work it out without isolating, you'd probably still end up with the correct answer. But over here you wouldn't. So on this side, what we need is this negative 2x inside the absolute value by itself. So we're going to move away whatever's on that same side, and that's the minus 3. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So now I have absolute value of negative 2x equals 14. So now that I have this isolated, I know that this number inside here, this negative 2x, could be 14 or negative 14, and that's how I break it up. So negative 2x equals 14, negative 2x equals negative 14, and I divide by 2 on divide by negative 2 on both sides. So the 2's cancel, the negatives cancel. I get x equals 14 divided by 2 is 7. Negative doesn't cancel, so it's negative 7. I can go ahead and shortcut myself, give myself a comma, so I can work over here. 2's cancel, negatives cancel, so I get x. Negatives cancel, 14 divided by 2 is 7, and the answer is 7. And so those are two of the more simpler types of isolating the variable and stuff like that, because I always find it easier to start with simpler ones, so you kind of get the gist and then work your way up. But always giving you examples of multiple layers or levels that you will see. So these next two, and they are our last two for the video, so I know you may be a little tired of talking about absolute value, is now we have multiplication and addition subtraction. So we're always looking at, okay, this is what I have to get by itself. And just like a two-step equation, so instead of having this absolute value here, you can pretend like it's an x, like it's 5x minus 14 equals 1, and you're going to solve that. I'd move the minus 14 first. So now I have 5 times the absolute value of x plus 7 equals 15. Then I divide by the 5. So now I have absolute value of x plus 7 equals 3. Now that I've isolated it, This is all by itself on this side of the equation. Now I can separate, because now I know this x plus 7 could be 3 or a negative 3, and that's exactly how I separate it. So x plus 7 could equal 3, or x plus 7 could equal negative 3. And we solve each one. So I minus 7 on both sides. I get x equals negative 4. I minus 7 on both sides. And remember, because this is a negative 3, I'm going to end up with a different answer, because a negative 3 and negative 7 will give me negative 10. And these are my two possibilities. And if you're ever wondering, like, if absolute value makes things always positive, then how can x be negative? And it all has to do with the mathematical setup of things. If you were to plug this in, you would find that it would work. So go back in and say, well, what's negative 4 plus 7? Oh, that's 3. What's absolute value of 3? 3. What's 5 times 3? 15. What's 15 minus 4? 1. And it totally works. And that's always an option, like, oh, I'm not so sure about my answer. Plug it back in. See if it works. It's always a good way to double check yourself so you're not sitting there stressing yourself out over, did I do it right? Did I not do it right? And it's always a good strategy for a test or a practice test. Okay, so on our last problem, we're going to look at, okay, here's my absolute value. I'm going to move everything away from it. And just like when we solve equations, we're going to go ahead and add or subtract first. The reason why we wouldn't divide by 3, because I'd have to divide everything by 3. And if I were to divide everything by 3, here, give me just a second. If I divide by 3, I'm going to end up with an 8/3 and a 2/3, and who wants to deal with those fractions? So we don't do that. We undo, we back up. Oops, maybe a little bit too far. There's my highlighting. And then I move the 8. So I subtract 8 on both sides. So now I have 3, absolute value of 2x minus 1 equals negative 6. I divide by 3. I get absolute value of 2x minus 1 equals negative 2. I'm looking at that absolute value, so I'm saying 2x minus 1 could be nothing. Well, why nothing? Because absolute value can't be equal to a negative number. This number ended up negative. And I can't have that. Absolute value, this number should always give me a positive answer. This has to be positive. And it's not. So this is a no solution. All that work. So be careful to not just go in habit and ignore if you end up with a negative there once you isolate your absolute value. Because that's where we throw in the tricky stuff. You kind of get going in a pattern, you're going and not thinking as much. You're just on auto mode. And autopilot is good for some things, not for others. You have to get to a point where you automatically recognize that, and then you can go on autopilot.